Let's now put this into a bit of contextual practice. I've got my skull project here, and I do have my reference lined up in the back. And what I would like is I would like to make sure that I do include the positive and negative booleans for this project, right, to make sure it's as accurate as I can make it. The positive booleans are going to be joining the face mask with my cranial structure here, right, but keeping my jaw and my mandible separate. Right. We'll also be carving in the eye sockets as well as the nasal cavity and the temporal lobe or the zygomatus structure that has a bit of a negative space here for your mandible or your jaw to connect here and move up and down. Okay. We want to be as accurate as we can, right? That's why we have the reference in here. So any little change that's different from the main result that I'm noticing, I will go ahead and address. Right? So first, let's deal with the positive booleans, because that's going to be one of the easier ones. Right? And again, I do recommend doing this step by step first, rather than asking ZBrush to try and boolean multiple things at the same time. Now, this is relatively light in resolution, so I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to make sure that we're not too far from the amount of polygons in the joining ones, right? This might make it a little bit easier for ZBrush to process that Boolean result. Before I go ahead and do that, I'm also going to make sure that I have two things set up. Okay? On the different Boolean objects, just to make it a little bit easier for myself, I'm going to assign a default polygroup value with Control W. And I'll go ahead and do that on each of the unique objects in here, just in case. Again, I'm going to leave the jaw alone. But for my cranial structure and the face mask, I'm going to positively Boolean them together. And to make the ZBrush result easier, I'm going to establish a topology line right where they're conjoining. Now, the secondary way of utilizing the Booleans is to instead use the folders inside of ZBrush. Folders are a parallel to groups inside of Maya, but they do come with a little bit more functionality. I'm going to go ahead and name that and place the cranial structure and the face mask inside of the group here. Right. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do, but one of the simplest things that I'm going to show you how to do today is just open up the little gear on the folder, right? So you affect every member that's inside of this group or folder, and look for the Boolean folder option. Right? I don't want to activate the dynamic subdiv option. I don't usually utilize that in my flow. Right. So just utilizing the basic Boolean folder button will do the same thing as hitting the make Boolean button down below in our subtool menu, but it'll keep it inside of the subtool, and it'll keep our original structures intact in case we need to change our minds or we didn't get a correct Boolean result. You can see it also hides the folder, so if I go ahead and select the new object, I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the paint button as well. You can clearly see that my objects have now been joined together. I do clearly have two polygroups, but I'm going to go ahead and activate my symmetry, go down to my geometry tab, look at my ZBrush options, activate the same, turn adapt off, keep groups on, smooth groups all the way down. This is a preference, and you can see the result, whether you like it or not, is up to you. Right? Especially at lower levels, I find I prefer to keep this off, but every now and then I will turn it on to get a smoother group insert between my resulting meshes. There you go. This is a much preferable polymesh result to what I had, and you can see it's quite clean. Good, perfect. Let's go ahead and progress through this just a little bit more. Now, we could have done all of the Booleans at once, but I do like a step-by-step procedure with this, so I'm going to make another folder, and this time I'm going to skip naming it just to work a little bit quicker, and a bit of my workflow is to just think about the basic shape of what I'm trying to create first, and then just find a primitive to represent that. So I'm going to look for the append or insert subtool menu here. Insert's just a little bit easier because it's going to grab the object and place it directly below my other subtool menu. Right, so my new cranial structure. And let's take care of the eye sockets. They're more or less a cylindrical structure. You can also use a sphere. It's up to you. I'm going to use a cylinder because I like the hard edge on the back. Hold shift while I'm rotating, and let's turn my solo off. And I'm just thinking about the negative shape. In fact, I can visualize the negative shape before I even make it a negative shape value. So we're just going to change this, and we can get this relatively accurate. I wouldn't recommend spending too much time to get this pinpoint accurate. We can spend some time trying to get this negative shape accurate, but I wouldn't recommend spending an overly long amount of time trying to get this photographically accurate. Once we process the Boolean result, it may change how the shape is interacting with the skull, and we'll want to do a little bit of resculpting anyways. I do recommend toggling your perspective on and off, especially if you're working from reference, and just double checking to see if things are looking more or less correct. You can start to see I'm starting to see a little bit of an issue on the inside of the eyeball here, so I'll have to go ahead and shape that for the slope of the nose. Whether I want to do that now or after I process the Boolean results is up to me as the artist. And you can see we can do a step-by-step process right now. The last thing that I will want to make sure of is just assigning a new polygroup all over this object. The last thing that I will want to do before I process the Boolean is just make sure I have efficient polygroups on all of my objects before I go ahead and do that. The more polygroups I'm asking ZBrush to pay attention to, the more it's going to have to process and the higher likelihood of a less efficient mesh on the result. So let's go ahead and do this quickly. There we go, let's go ahead and Boolean the folder. I now have multiple folders. I find that's not a problem. In fact, I encourage it. Duplicates are fantastic, just in case you need to go back and redo some details. Turn my brush symmetry on. It is a new object. I'm going to make sure that my global symmetry is on, so keep the local symmetry off because I'm working in the middle of the world. Now, I might want to ensure that this transition retains that edge. So Control Shift clicking on this new resulting polygroup will allow me to go ahead and utilize the polygroup by normals, just like we did before. Now, if I go in, you can see my ZBrush menu has changed settings back to default. That's because every new object resets the menu. Now, you should be able to see when we check our ZBrush menu that the settings have reset back to the menu defaults. That's because every time we create a Boolean operation, right, or grab a new object, ZBrush is going to reset those menu values, but remember that uniquely for each subtool. This just means you'll have to pay attention to this every time we Boolean a new resulting mesh. Thankfully, the process is pretty much the exact same, right? And you can see I do get a very clean ZBrush result off of this. And again, I find patience pays off quite a bit with this. And just building it up structure by structure can help make this quite a bit easier. There we go. We do have a little bit of a nasal cavity and the side zygomatic structure. I will probably do that in one singular step, just to make this a little bit more efficient. The zygomatic structure is a nice thin space, so again, I encourage you to think about the negative shape first. Right? Thinking about the shape language is always a beneficial idea. With this object, instead of hitting Control W with this, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my polygroups. Actually, I'm going to decide not to do that. And if I change my mind, we'll go ahead and update that later in the video. Thankfully, because of the nature of our live Boolean result, I do get to change my mind quite a bit as I'm setting up these decently complex operations. I find that this is one of my favorite features inside of ZBrush because it allows me to work with positive and negative spaces very freely without worrying about the resulting topology yet, as long as I have my menu items set up correctly. Now, you will want to watch out for overlapping Boolean operations like this. So I don't want to see all the way through the eye socket. I will have to be very careful with that. Thankfully, I can double check my Boolean and adjust it and make it just the right size before I process it. And this is rather accurate, right? That little zygomatic hole on the side of the temporal lobe is not a very, very, very deep structure, right? Not a very large structure. It is quite thin. So I just have to work this a little bit more. I don't really like that I'm going to get a result here that leaves me with a bit of a ledge. So I'm going to go ahead and treat that with another negative Boolean. Right. And just address that with a different object. Let's go ahead and insert. Hit Control W to assign a new polygroup to this object. And this time I'm just going to line this up and make this a bit wider of a cylinder and take away some of the negative space on the bottom here. I don't want to cut too far into my maxilla. Might need to do some resulting smoothing as well. And don't forget, you can always move these objects at the same time. So, just move a few points around here, and I should get a much, much more desirable result with that. Pardon me. And once I've adjusted the height of this to the appropriate angle, when I get my desired result, we can go ahead and Boolean this structure. In fact, you know what? Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the nose. I'll just go ahead and duplicate my cylinder. Control-Shift-D is the hotkey, and move this structure roughly where it's supposed to be, and make it roughly the shape it's supposed to be. Set up my negative Boolean, turn my perspective off, and double check my reference. Right. Now, this is a little bit different, but that's all right. Let's see. I do believe my pivot's a little bit off. I'm just going to reset the orientation by holding Alt while my Move Scale Rotate widget is up and clicking on the Reset Orientation button. Right. So just make sure you hold Alt to do this. Otherwise, you move the actual object itself. Now my reference isn't completely in the middle of the world, but that's alright. I don't need to be perfectly accurate at this stage. We do want to be accurate, right? It's a very important thing. But rapidity is also something we want to think about. And I want to be able to create these shapes quite quickly, especially now, because I am going to spend some time remeshing things at the end of it. Let's make sure when I'm pulling this stuff out, I'm going right from the middle. I'm going to have to smooth out the inner eye socket here quite a bit and get a nice smooth transition for the nasalis, but I'll probably be quite better off waiting until I finish that Boolean operation before adjusting that far too much. Especially because I am using some of that negative space, and we do need to remesh regardless. Let's go ahead, go back to our folder, say Boolean that folder again. It does give me a brand new resulting mesh. Let's just double check the polygroups. Should be okay. This might start to cause problems. Right? Now, for more hard-shaped objects, you might really want to ensure you have the right polygroups, but for more organic objects, if I find I don't like the result, I'll go ahead and overwrite the polygroups, okay, and work with it a little bit more organically. Let's just see what we get with our default menu. Again, same, adapt off, keep groups, smooth groups, all the way down, brush symmetry on because it is a symmetrical object, and hit the button. It's not too bad actually. I don't like that little split that's right in the middle right here. And this is probably where I'm asking it to do a little bit too much with the polygroups, or I might actually have a bit of an issue with this transition right in here. Right? Now, I think I actually set that up incorrectly, so I'm going to go ahead and delete my subtool, that's the resulting Boolean object, so that I can go back and adjust the nose and get the correct depth to the object before I Boolean, and probably even go ahead and regroup my group normals. That'll give me a polygroup on the caps and one on the outside edges, which is probably going to give me a little bit cleaner of a result. Let's go ahead and Boolean that one more time and see if we get what we want. If you don't like the resulting mesh, you always have the option to go back. Right. There we go. That should be a little bit cleaner. We'll see. There we go. Set the menu up just like we did and hit the button. Quite a bit better. Right. Let's try one more thing. I'm going to double up first to see if I can really make sure I don't lose way too much information right here. Seems to be a little bit difficult, so let's turn on our detect edges as well, just to reinforce that. It seems to be not liking some of the thinness in here. So instead of utilizing all of that, let's just turn the keep groups off and see if we do get a decent resulting mesh. This is a hard surface object. It's also organic, but it's not going to deform. So I'm a lot more comfortable with having topology that works for my sculpt, right? And not concerning myself too much with deformation. However, you have to think to yourself if the object that you're Z-remeshing is going to deform. If it is, then you need to have more specific topology in the places that it is going to deform. Otherwise, it will not work for your intent. This is a much, much, much better result on my Booleans. I'm going to go ahead and soften up quite a few of the edges here, especially on the brow. And now I can actually get back to some of the aesthetics instead of worrying about the technical details. As a preference, I like to establish my topology early on in my sculpt. So that means taking care of most of my positive and negative Booleans as early as I can. It is going to result in a change in my base topology, and if that base topology changes, it might impact other people that I'm working with, especially the rigging department and animation departments. And if you're working with multiple people, you don't want to impact their work negatively and cause them to do more work without reason. It's something that I really, really, really suggest thinking about, right, when you're starting your own projects, whether you're at a larger studio or just starting off on your own home projects. That little bit of foresight will help you complete projects a lot easier. Now with my reference up here, I can pretty much rotoscope this, kind of soften out some of the edges on the inside of the eye here a little bit more with the shift smooth. Make sure I'm matching the outlines from the front if I need to do a little bit of reshaping. It's much, much, much easier to do this on an object that has all of my topology needs, and I don't have to worry about remeshing now. There. Top of the skull is looking much, much better. Let's just shift that second mouse a bit. You can see I've mostly been using move and smooth. For thinner parts of this, I will use an inflate brush. If I don't quite like the topology there, I'll just give it a quick remesh as I adjust this. Yeah. That's a bit better. Inflate and pinch inversely will allow me to make sections of this thicker or quite a bit sharper. And I'm going to do quite a bit of this work now on this level of topology before I move on. Once I have my base level topology set, I don't want to change it too much, right? I want to get into the sculpting phase, which means I'm going to be subdividing and adding surface detail. We don't want to do that until we nail the outlines, the silhouette, and the proportions of this. So I'm going to double check my reference. I'm feeling pretty good. I might need to make the back of the head just a teeny bit wider here. I'm actually feeling quite good about this. And I do have to remember my reference was taken with a perspective camera, not an orthographic camera. It is a rather long lens, but it is still a perspective camera, so I'm not going to be able to get an accurate, true orthographic in there. Let's just shape the teeth in that correct U. It's not really the teeth, it's the maxilla area. But to be accurate is preferable, right? If you want your characters or sculpts to look more appealing, we want visual accuracy on base anatomical objects. It's paying attention to those structures. It's giving me structure here, so all of my bone sections. Whether it's the nasalis, the glabella region, the zygomatus, or the maxilla, all of that gives the structure in here. This is much more accurate than what we started off with. Perfect. And now I do have some little lumpy areas, and I do recommend keeping that stuff in here. Happy little accidents will benefit our sculpt as we start to progress through here. Now, I do have two different sections in here, but it's easier for me to come through, look at the mandible, start to adjust the different sections. I do believe a pinch brush will be a lot easier, just to thin out the sections here and make them as appropriately thin as they need to be. They're a little bit comically large right now. And if I thin them out just a little bit too much, just like I did before, I will go ahead and inflate with the inflate brush. Or undo. Don't forget, one of your most powerful brushes is going to be your undo button. Let's just adjust that so it's not too square and round it out quite a bit. A little bit better. Let's check it against our reference. As I always suggest using when you're starting out, even when you're not starting out, using reference is a much easier way to work, because it takes the guessing out. We don't want to guess too much. I can rely on my knowledge of anatomy, but I'll forget stuff. It never hurts to have reference. Much better. Just turn my solo off. That's looking a lot better. There's little nodules in here that I can just, I'm just going to hold Alt and tap on the object so that I can go ahead and sculpt it instead of my deselected object. This time I hold Alt and tap on the mandible, and I can go ahead and sculpt on it. And I've got my major structures established. Now, for both of these, as long as I'm happy with the base topology, what I can do is I can start subdividing, adding surface detail, deciding whether I want to build up a little bit of volume with clay brushes or other surface detail brushes until I get the desired end result. But the point of this is having an active and accurate, as well as easier to use, base topology level before we start going in and adding any subdivisions. If you have to retopologize after starting your sculpt, you will have to go through and figure out a way to copy your detail from your retopologized version, from the high-res version with all the surface detail to your retopolized version. Right? It's not impossible. In fact, it's quite easy. It's a pretty standard workflow, but establishing your topology first with some accurate Z remesh use as well as your polygroups is a much more preferable way to work.